When a major transformation approaches, the psyche does not greet it with clarity or calm. It begins, instead, with an unsettling whisper from the depths, a disturbance in the emotional field, a discomfort that cannot be easily named. The person begins to feel as though something within them is stirring, rising, pressing against the surface of their awareness. This is the emergence of the shadow, not in its mythic monstrous form, but as a collection of denied truths, forgotten memories, and unlived aspects of the self that are no longer willing to remain silent. The shadow does not appear to destroy, but to integrate. It rises when the ego can no longer carry the weight of its own illusion. That which has been buried, pain not processed, fears not faced, desires disowned, begins to speak in symptoms: irritability with no cause, fatigue that rest cannot fix, anxiety that floats just beneath the skin. The person often mistakes this as weakness, as failure. But the truth is quite the opposite. The psyche is beginning the deep and necessary work of reordering the inner world. It is preparing for expansion by forcing confrontation with the parts of oneself that have long been neglected. No one undergoes a real-life shift without first encountering this inner turbulence. The unconscious does not release its contents easily. It demands attention, and it often chooses moments of emotional instability to make itself known. The shadow reveals itself in projections, in the people we dislike irrationally, in the traits we cannot stand in others, in the triggers that feel disproportionately intense. It reveals itself in compulsions, addictions, and repetitive cycles that no longer serve us but remain persistent. These are not random. They are reflections of unresolved fragments of the psyche. Fragments that must be gathered if wholeness is to be achieved. At the threshold of transformation, the shadow does not knock politely. It erupts. It sends a wave of uncertainty through the structures of the ego. The person might find themselves doubting everything they once believed about who they are, what they want, what they're meant to do. This is not confusion in the superficial sense. It is a psychic cleansing, a stripping away of the false self. The chaos that emerges is purposeful. It is a dismantling of the inner walls that kept the unconscious safely locked away. The psyche no longer consents to division. It longs for unity, and that longing begins by forcing what was hidden into the light. There is pain in this emergence, and many resist it. They seek distraction that numbs rather than soothes. They reach for certainty when the only true healing lies in surrender. But the shadow is patient. It will wait as long as it must, and then it will return with greater force. The person may experience recurring emotional patterns, self-sabotage, failed relationships, creative blockages, until they recognize the common thread: the unresolved self trying to be seen. The invitation is always the same: to turn inward, to feel what was once unfelt, to understand the origin of the inner conflict rather than continue projecting it outward onto the world. Often, the shadow is made up of the very parts of us that were shamed, dismissed, or punished in childhood. The need to cry, to rage, to be vulnerable. These expressions were once deemed unacceptable and thus exiled into the unconscious. But they did not die. They simply went underground, waiting for the moment when the individual would be strong enough to carry them again. Before a major life shift, these exiled parts rise, not to torment, but to rejoin. The person is given an opportunity to reclaim what was once abandoned, to become whole not by adding something new, but by retrieving something old and sacred. The emergence of the shadow also carries wisdom. There is insight buried within emotional pain. There is direction hidden inside discontent. If one listens carefully, the shadow will not only show what is wounded, it will point toward what is possible. Every shadow carries a potential that was never lived. The anger may contain unclaimed power. The sadness may hold unexpressed creativity. The fear may conceal the call to courage. When one is willing to meet the shadow with openness rather than resistance, the transformation begins. The psyche starts to rearrange itself. The energies that were trapped in repression become available for conscious use. This is the threshold space, the liminal zone between who one was and who one is becoming. It is not comfortable, but it is sacred. The psyche, through the emergence of the shadow, is declaring that the old way is no longer viable, that the persona, the mask worn to navigate the world, is cracking. That truth must rise, even if it breaks what came before. The person stands at a crossroads, not externally but within. Will they continue to suppress what is calling from beneath? Or will they turn toward the shadow, sit with it, and allow it to teach them the deeper nature of their own soul? This encounter is not a one-time event. It is a process, often cyclical. The psyche reveals itself in layers, peeling back the familiar to expose the forgotten. And each time the shadow rises, it brings with it a message that the next stage of life cannot be built on the same psychological foundation. That growth requires not more effort, but more truth. The individual must begin to feel what they have avoided, to question what they've assumed, to confront what they fear. In doing so, they step into the alchemical fire of transformation, a fire that does not destroy but refines, a fire that burns away the lie to make space for the soul. Before a major shift occurs in life, the psyche does not offer comfort. It initiates disorientation. The breakdown of identity is one of the most unsettling yet crucial processes in psychological transformation. We live for years wearing masks shaped by culture, expectation, trauma, and survival. These masks become familiar. We call them me. But the psyche knows when a structure is no longer sustainable, when a form once protective has become a prison. The breakdown of identity is not the end of selfhood, it is the dismantling of a false self that no longer serves the unfolding of the deeper, truer self. In the beginning, the disintegration feels like confusion. What once made sense no longer does. Goals lose their luster. Relationships that once felt essential begin to feel misaligned. The routines and roles that once provided stability start to feel suffocating. The individual may feel lost, but this lostness is a sign of growth, not failure. When identity dissolves, it creates space for the psyche to expand. The persona, the constructed image presented to the world, begins to crack. Through those cracks, the authentic self, long buried beneath layers of adaptation and social conditioning, begins to whisper. The psyche reveals its discontent not in language, but in feeling. A deep restlessness takes root. The individual may feel detached from their past ambitions, unable to articulate what they want next, only certain that the current path is no longer viable. This is not indecision. It is a sacred pause, a liminal space between chapters where the old self fades and the new self has not yet emerged. The ego resists this phase because it thrives on structure and certainty. But the soul knows that the breakdown is not random. It is an initiation into a deeper mode of being. As identity crumbles, grief arises. One grieves not just people or places but versions of themselves. The self that worked so hard to be accepted, the self that sacrificed desire for approval, the self that performed competence while secretly breaking inside. All these selves were necessary for a time, but no longer aligned with the truth that is emerging. The psyche mourns their loss even as it prepares to evolve. The grief is not weakness, it is acknowledgement. It is the psyche recognizing the weight of what has been carried and the courage it takes to put it down. This breakdown is often accompanied by existential questions. Who am I without this job? Without this relationship? Without this role I've always played? These questions are painful because they reveal the dependency of identity on external structures. When those structures collapse, the inner scaffolding is exposed. At first, it may seem like there's nothing left, but this emptiness is fertile. The psyche is not erasing identity. It is clearing space for something more integrated to arise. An identity rooted not in reaction, but in awareness. The mind may panic in this phase, attempting to quickly build a new identity to avoid the discomfort of the unknown. But premature construction only delays the necessary process of deconstruction. The psyche demands patience. It asks that you sit in the ashes without rushing to rebuild. It is in this sacred stillness, this threshold space, that transformation takes place. The old story disintegrates so a new narrative can be written, not imposed from the outside, but discovered from within. The breakdown also reveals hidden truths. When the ego loosens its grip, the unconscious becomes more accessible. Memories, insights, and forgotten desires rise to the surface. The individual may begin to recall dreams from childhood, feel the resurgence of long-buried passions, or hear an inner voice that was once drowned out by the noise of conformity. These revelations are not hallucinations, they are psychic truths that were waiting for the collapse of egoic defenses in order to be heard. The psyche uses the breakdown to reorient you toward a life that is more honest, more alive, and more aligned with your essence. The outer world often misunderstands this phase. Friends may say you're having a crisis. Society may call it burnout or a midlife meltdown. But these labels miss the point. What is happening is not a malfunction, it is a metamorphosis. You are not breaking down because you are weak. You are breaking down because a deeper self is breaking through. The structures that once held you are too small for the soul that is now emerging. The psyche is asking you to let go of what you think you are, so that you can remember what you have always been beneath the conditioning. This process cannot be rushed. It must unfold in its own time, following the rhythm of your unique psychological landscape. The mind may want clarity, but the soul speaks in symbols, dreams, and intuition. The breakdown of identity is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. One must learn to tolerate ambiguity, to stay present with the discomfort, to trust that something meaningful is taking shape, even when all familiar structures are dissolving. In this way, the breakdown becomes a doorway, and the self that walks through it is not smaller, but more whole, more awake, more real. When the psyche is preparing for a significant life shift, it does not always speak in direct, rational language. Instead, it begins to communicate through the symbolic, through patterns, images, and metaphors that bypass the logical mind and speak to something far older within us. This symbolic communication often appears most vividly in dreams, synchronicities, and recurring emotional themes. These are not coincidences or idle imaginings. They are messages from the unconscious, signals that something profound is stirring beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The psyche, in its wisdom, begins to offer glimpses of what must be faced, what must be understood, and what must be released in order to evolve. Dreams, in particular, become charged during these threshold moments. They may grow in frequency, in intensity, in emotional weight. Even those who usually do not remember their dreams may find themselves waking with vivid images or a lingering emotional residue they cannot shake. The content of these dreams is rarely straightforward. A house may represent the psyche itself. A storm may symbolize emotional turmoil. A locked door may speak to an aspect of the self that remains inaccessible. These symbols are not random. They are the language of the unconscious, expressing truths that words cannot hold. When such symbols repeat, when particular themes resurface night after night, it is a sign that the deeper self is seeking recognition. The mind, trained to rely on logic and analysis, often dismisses such symbolic material. But the psyche is older than reason. It speaks in the same language that myths, fairy tales, and spiritual traditions have used for centuries, the language of archetype. During times of transformation, these archetypal energies begin to rise from the depths. The hero, the shadow, the guide, the rebirth motif. They appear in dreams, in art, in thoughts that feel larger than the individual self. One may dream of falling endlessly, of walking through unfamiliar forests, of being pursued by something faceless. These are not to be feared or avoided. They are to be engaged with. Each image carries a fragment of psychological truth, a thread leading toward a deeper understanding of the self. Synchronicities also become more noticeable during these periods. You think of a person and they call. You encounter the same book title 3 times in a week. You hear a particular phrase from different people in different contexts. These experiences seem to defy chance. They provoke a sense of meaningful coincidence, not causally connected, but intimately tied in significance. The psyche uses synchronicity to get your attention, to affirm an inner state with an outer event. It is as though the inner world and the outer world momentarily align, reflecting each other in a mysterious dance. When synchronicities increase, they suggest that you are standing near the threshold of psychological transformation. They are invitations to look more closely at what is moving beneath the surface. Patterns in waking life also shift. Certain emotional responses may become more intense. Old triggers resurface. Relationships may suddenly feel strained, or roles you once accepted without question now feel unbearable. These repetitions are not regressions. They are the psyche's way of highlighting unresolved material. The same lessons appear in new forms until they are integrated. If you repeatedly encounter similar relational dynamics, abandonment, betrayal, power struggle, it is not a curse, but a call to examine the source within. The psyche does not bring these themes forward to punish. It brings them forward to complete them. During these phases, You may also feel drawn to certain symbols or images without understanding why. A particular animal, a certain color, a landscape you've never visited may appear again and again in your inner or outer life. These symbols are often carriers of psychic energy. They resonate not because they are aesthetically pleasing, but because they are meaningful. They belong to the inner story that is seeking expression. To engage with them, to paint them, write about them, meditate on them, is to participate consciously in your own unfolding. The psyche does not want to be interpreted mechanically. It wants to be witnessed, honored, and explored. What all of these symbolic forms have in common is that they arrive when the rational mind is no longer sufficient for what the soul is undergoing. Logic alone cannot carry you through transformation. At some point, you must listen with more than your ears. You must feel with more than your heart. You must see with more than your eyes. The psyche begins to lead the way, but it does so through impressions, not instructions. The map is not drawn in ink but in metaphor, and it requires a different kind of attention, an intuitive, receptive, imaginative awareness that modern life rarely encourages but which the soul demands. This symbolic dimension is not something separate from daily life. It weaves through every moment, waiting for your attention. The question is not whether the psyche is speaking, but whether you are listening. As the inner and outer worlds begin to mirror one another more vividly, it becomes clear that something is shifting. The symbols are not warnings, they are guides. They emerge to prepare you, to inform you, and to align you with a deeper truth that is ready to unfold. Before the unfolding of a major life shift, the psyche often retreats into a quiet, inward space. This withdrawal is not a symptom of weakness or regression, but a necessary turning inward that precedes profound psychological transformation. The individual may suddenly feel disconnected from the outer world, losing interest in social activities, conversations, or even goals that once felt urgent. This pull towards solitude is not depression in the pathological sense. It is the soul demanding stillness, silence, and space to reorganize itself. When the outer world begins to fade in its grip, and the inner world grows louder, it is a signal that the self is undergoing deep reconfiguration. In solitude, the psyche prepares. The noise of the external world, its demands, its distractions, its endless invitations to perform, begins to fall away. What remains is a kind of psychological rawness. Thoughts that were long suppressed begin to rise. Emotions stored in the body begin to make themselves known. This is not the quiet of emptiness, but of gestation. Like the seed buried in soil or the caterpillar in the chrysalis, the transformation is hidden but active. The outer stillness conceals an inner storm. One is not collapsing but incubating. This inner retreat is the soul pulling its energy inward to regenerate, to reflect, and to prepare for the shift that is coming. The withdrawal is rarely chosen consciously. It often emerges as a kind of fatigue with the world. The conversations that once felt energizing now feel hollow. The company that once brought joy now stirs discomfort. The very act of participation begins to feel like a burden. This is not because the world has changed, but because the self is shedding layers that no longer fit. What once resonated no longer aligns. The psyche begins to withdraw its projections from the world, the ideas, desires, and identities that were unconsciously placed onto relationships, careers, and roles, and calls them back to be re-examined. Solitude becomes the necessary space in which this re-evaluation can occur. In this withdrawal, the individual may feel confused or even guilty. Modern society values productivity, extroversion, and constant engagement. To step back, to rest, to do nothing is often viewed as failure, but the psyche follows a different rhythm, one that cannot be dictated by calendars or deadlines. In solitude, the soul recalibrates. The silence that may at first seem empty begins to reveal its depth. Insights surface without effort. Long neglected inner voices begin to speak. The self begins to feel not smaller, but more expansive. It is in solitude that the individual reconnects with their own rhythm, their own truth, their own intuitive knowing that had long been drowned out by the expectations of others. This inward movement also brings confrontation. Without the distractions of noise, the individual must face themselves. This can be uncomfortable. All the parts of the psyche that were buried under activity begin to rise. Regrets, fears, unmet needs, old wounds. They emerge not to torment, but to be integrated. solitude creates the container for this inner dialogue. It becomes a sacred space where the conscious mind and the unconscious can meet. The boundaries between surface identity and deeper truth begin to blur. One begins to realize how many decisions were made from fear, how many roles were adopted for approval, how much of life was lived in reaction rather than authenticity. But solitude is not only confrontation, it is also revelation. In the stillness, the individual may feel a new sense of connection with something greater than themselves. This could take the form of nature, spirit, intuition, or simply a deeper awareness of the interconnectedness of all things. There is a feeling that something within is being aligned with a deeper current. The solitude reveals that the individual was never truly alone, only disconnected from their own inner guidance. The silence becomes a teacher. The self, stripped of distraction, becomes more visible. This inward journey is not about rejecting the world permanently. It is a necessary phase of psychological alchemy. Just as the night prepares for the day, withdrawal prepares for reemergence. The energy that was once scattered outward begins to collect inward. The self becomes more cohesive, more grounded, more whole. The person who enters solitude is not the same as the one who will eventually return. Something essential is being remembered, something that was always present beneath the surface. In solitude, the psyche finds its roots again. It reclaims its own voice, its own vision, its own direction, not imposed from outside, but arising from within. As the psyche approaches a significant life shift, it initiates a confrontation with what has been avoided, denied, or repressed. This confrontation with the shadow is not incidental, it is essential. The shadow consists of all the aspects of the self that the ego has deemed unacceptable: emotions, desires, memories, impulses, and potentials that were once banished to the unconscious for the sake of adaptation. But when transformation is imminent, these disowned parts no longer remain hidden. They rise to the surface with force, demanding attention, recognition, and ultimately integration. This process is not gentle. It is destabilizing, often painful, but deeply necessary. For no authentic growth can occur without first reclaiming what has been cut away from the self. This encounter with the shadow often begins with projection. You see qualities in others that disturb you, irritate you, or stir intense emotion. You may become obsessed with the arrogance of a coworker, the selfishness of a friend, the recklessness of a stranger. These reactions are clues. They point to elements of your own psyche that have not been acknowledged. The shadow does not only contain the dark or negative. It contains everything you have not allowed yourself to be. It may include strength repressed in favor of passivity, creativity buried beneath conformity, or sensuality exiled due to shame. The people and situations that provoke the strongest reactions are mirrors reflecting what is unclaimed within you. In this way, the outer world becomes a stage upon which the inner drama unfolds. As the psyche prepares for change, it stops allowing these projections to go unnoticed. The same conflicts arise repeatedly, as if orchestrated by something deeper than chance. Old wounds are reopened. Relationships begin to mirror long-standing emotional patterns. Internal contradictions become unbearable. The shadow refuses to stay silent. It insists on being felt, seen, and brought into conscious awareness. What was once dismissed as "just the way I am" begins to feel like a limitation. What was once blamed on others begins to be recognized as something that lives within. This turning point, when projection is withdrawn and ownership begins, is the threshold of transformation. The shadow, however, is not an enemy. It is not to be exorcised or eradicated, but understood. It holds the energy of authenticity, of wholeness, of inner freedom. The parts of the self that were exiled were not inherently wrong. They were simply inconvenient to the persona the ego constructed to survive. But surviving is not the same as living. The psyche knows when survival strategies have become prisons, and so it forces a confrontation. This may come in the form of anxiety, depression, rage, or numbness, not as a malfunction, but as a message. The symptoms are the psyche's way of breaking through the rigidity of ego structures that no longer serve the unfolding of the true self. To engage with the shadow is to descend into the underworld of the self. It is to face one's own jealousy, greed, rage, shame, fear, not to indulge them, but to understand their origins. The shadow is born in childhood when the child learns that certain feelings or behaviors are unacceptable. The need for love and belonging compels the child to repress those parts. But they do not vanish. They live on, buried in the unconscious, coloring perceptions, shaping choices, and creating cycles of self-sabotage. As adulthood unfolds, the price of this repression becomes heavier. Until the shadow is faced, the self remains divided. Healing comes not from perfection, but from integration. Integration means making conscious what was unconscious. It means taking responsibility for your emotional landscape, your impulses, your projections. It means asking not, "What is wrong with me?" but "What is this feeling trying to reveal?" When the shadow is brought into awareness, it loses its destructive power and becomes a source of insight. Rage transforms into a boundary. Envy reveals a forgotten desire. Shame points toward the part of you that still seeks love. Each shadow quality, once accepted, becomes a key to deeper self-understanding. The psyche does not demand that you be pure. It demands that you be whole. This confrontation with the shadow is often misunderstood. It is not a phase to be rushed through or avoided. It is not something to fix with positivity or self-improvement techniques. It is a sacred and necessary descent. It is alchemical in nature, a psychological death that gives rise to rebirth. The person who confronts their shadow emerges more compassionate, more rooted, more capable of navigating complexity. The mask of perfection falls away, and in its place stands a human being who knows their depths. The journey into the shadow is not about becoming someone new. It is about reclaiming who you have always been, beneath the layers of denial and fear. True transformation does not arrive through external change alone, nor does it unfold in linear, predictable steps. It is an organic, often chaotic process driven by the deep intelligence of the psyche. Before a major life shift, the inner world begins to stir, revealing symbols, inviting solitude, resurfacing the shadow, and compelling the ego to relinquish its illusions of control. What may appear as confusion, stagnation, or emotional upheaval is, in truth, the self reorienting itself around something more authentic, more whole. This journey is not about becoming someone else, but about remembering what has always been hidden within. The psyche does not move toward superficial reinvention, but toward integration. The images that appear in dreams, the silence that calls you inward, the emotions that rise unbidden, and the aspects of self long denied. All of these are invitations to participate in your own becoming. They are not signs of failure, but of awakening. To listen to the psyche is to reclaim a forgotten way of knowing, one that honors intuition, accepts paradox, and welcomes the unknown as a necessary companion. It is to understand that growth is not linear, that clarity often follows confusion, and that meaning reveals itself only when we are willing to dwell in the questions. The path to wholeness requires courage, not because it demands strength, but because it demands honesty. And in that honesty, in that sacred return to what was once disowned, the self becomes not only healed, but transformed.